Mark, thank you so much for joining this webinar series. We are delighted to have you with us.
Thank you, Juan. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you everybody for joining today.
So, Mark, if I recall correctly, we met for the first time 10 years ago in Colombia, in Cartagena, in a sustainability event organized by the IFC. And back then, you were only starting FNMPC with Nilo Edwards. And 10 years later, you have a membership of 180 First Nations. You support many of them negotiating equity deals in projects over $100 million.
Yes.
And you convene an annual conference that brings together over 1,800 people from First Nations, large companies, government officials from the federal government and provincial governments. And it has become sort of the go-to place to discuss equity partnerships in Canada and internationally as well. So, can you tell us what triggered FNMPC? What made FNMPC come to life? And what's the explanation for this amazing growth in 10 years?
Approximately 10 years ago, here in the province of British Columbia, which is where I'm calling you from, there were 11 Indigenous communities, First Nations, that's what we call ourselves here, who negotiated a 30% equity stake or ownership of a natural gas pipeline. The pipeline was valued at $5 billion. But what the communities quickly discovered is that because we do not have assets, we have rights to land, but we don't own the land, it's held in trust by the government. Those communities could not access capital. They could not get the money needed to invest in the 30%. So they lost the opportunity. The community leaders and chiefs at that time thought this is going to happen again. We needed an Indigenous organization that understood the problem, mainly how to access money at an affordable rate for investment, and then also how to structure our communities to work in a commercial structure with other communities. Pipelines, transmission lines for electricity, most projects now involve a number of communities. So that was where the community started. They started the coalition, 11 nations, 11 communities. But as you pointed out, it's grown to 184. We had two more join yesterday, so we're now at 186. And these communities are in 5 different time zones across Canada. So that is 1/3 of all the Indigenous communities in Canada. So that is where the coalition has started. And as you pointed out, we have grown and grown. We have never advertised. We are a nonprofit, Indigenous-led organization that provides services to communities when they ask for it. We do not impose financial solutions on communities, but our growth has been amazing.
Thank you, Mark. Um, let's lay out the basics of equity ownership and how that happens, because there is some confusion here in the region that this is about a handout. Some people believe this is about giving communities a piece of a project for free or in exchange of the use of their lands and their consent. But I have heard you speak many times, and you usually say this is an opportunity to invest that is given to communities. So, can you please share with us what this is and what this isn't?
So the coalition has two main functions for Indigenous communities or Indigenous nations. What we do in Canada is that we promote the environmental values of Indigenous communities to be incorporated in the project and the economic interests. Economics, essentially, as you pointed out, is not a grant. We will provide services to communities to co-invest. The challenge for many Indigenous communities is we do not have a lot of money in the communities. So how do you find that money? So what we do is that we will help the communities access lower priced capital money, usually through a loan guarantee program. In Canada, the governments now have recognized that if you do not have Indigenous participation in a major project, there will be delays, there will be protests. Investors do not want to invest in a project with excessive risk. Indigenous protests are risks. So what we'll do is help them find that capital. Loan guarantee programs are one way. Another way is to work with the companies to understand that if there is an Indigenous ownership in the project, there will be revenues from that ownership. That revenues then can be borrowed against, or you could use it as some sort of leverage to get capital. We will work with other nonprofits to access monies. It's creative and it's done differently in every case. I would like to point out, I didn't say this at the beginning, the coalition right now is sponsoring or helping on 11 projects across the country, across Canada, the total capital expenditure of $45 billion. In some cases, Indigenous people have negotiated ownership options to invest, 50% in the case of electric transmission lines crossing different parts of the country, 10% in natural gas projects. In some cases, the Indigenous community has put forward a solution, for example, geothermal electricity plants, where it is 100% Indigenous owned. So the creativity is required to match the project and to match the community. But as you pointed out, our growth is because we provide practical solutions that help not just the Indigenous community reach their economic and environmental goals, but it helps the companies because we reduce the risk for other investors to invest in the company. So that's why we've had such growth.
So let's unpack this a little bit. Uh, this is an opportunity for Indigenous communities to invest in projects. Now, the communities do not have assets that they can use as collateral, so it is difficult for them to access capital to be able to make these, very significant investments in these projects, especially if you want to reach 50% ownership. So the Canada has come up with some interesting innovations like loan guarantees, and other different instruments. Can you sort of speak a little bit to how loan guarantees work and other instruments that are being used?
Two of the main instruments that Indigenous communities here will use to access capital was one, the Loan Guarantee Program. The reason, as I mentioned earlier, is that we do not own our assets. Our lands are held in trust by the government that we use, but because of that, we do not have titles. We cannot use that as collateral. What the loan guarantee program is essentially the government guaranteeing that if the payments aren't made on a loan, that they will pay the loan. But what that does is it reduces the risk and the cost of capital. So it'll be almost the same cost as government borrowing. We can then use that to go to financial firms, to banks, to organizations that have capital, that they'll see that their investment is protected. Done properly, a loan guarantee will not cost the government anything because the project will finance the cash. They will finance the money itself. So done properly, there will never be government money involved, only the guarantee. The government agencies that do this are very good at evaluating the risk and the financial solidness of the project. There is also in Canada another group called the First Nations Financial Authority. And what it does is that it will evaluate the cash flows that will come from a project. So for example, if it's an electric transmission line or a solar energy plant, and they know that the revenues over 25 years are a certain amount, they can issue a bond for that revenue in future years, and they sell those bonds in Toronto and New York to non-Indigenous investors because non-Indigenous investors want the stable cash flows, either for pension funds or other investors. They have raised they've raised billions of dollars right now for Indigenous communities who then take that money and then invest it in the project so they can then access the future cash flows. Those are the two main instruments being used right now. But as Juan pointed out, the conference that we host every year in Canada has gotten so much interest now from investors and also from the financial firms and the companies who understand that if they have an Indigenous partner, the risk for other investors goes down, that they want to see more of this happen. So at the conference coming up in April in Toronto, we will have a discussion about the first bond that will be issued without a loan guarantee by Indigenous people to access the financial markets. That will be a game changer for the amount of capital that nations can access. So success builds on success to builds on success. So over the past 10 years, we have demonstrated that we as Indigenous people are not a risk. We are an opportunity. And that has been the big change in Canada.
That's fantastic. We have confirmed that Shanna Martineau will be joining us in February in this webinar. So we will be talking at length about loan guarantees. But the experience of the FNFA is also fantastic. This is an Indigenous financial institution doing unbelievable work. So thanks so much for bringing that up. Um, so Tell us, we understand that about 85% of the deals that you're helping your membership negotiate equity partnerships in are related to energy projects, mostly renewable energy or transmission line projects. What is it with energy projects that makes it so attractive for Indigenous people to participate as equity partners?
In Canada, you were right. 85% of the projects that come to us are clean energy. And the reasons for that are two reasons. One of them is that a clean energy project is usually more compatible with our Indigenous values. The other projects that come are mining projects, usually. There's some transportation projects as well in there and some real estate development. But mining is a very difficult thing for many of our people to embrace because it disrupts the land. It leaves a legacy that can go on forever once a mine leaves. There are also environmental issues that come forward with them. The other challenge for mining projects is they're very expensive. 5, 6, $7 billion to build a major mine. How does a nation invest or even find capital for a project that is so large that our investment will be very small? Clean energy projects, on the other hand, they are compatible with the environmental values of our nations. They're also easier to finance. They tend to be smaller. They also have usually a guaranteed purchaser of the energy for 25 years. We also then have a regulated return. Governments in Canada regulate that there will be 9, 10, 12%, whatever the rate is negotiated. But that then is set for 25 years. So you have a situation where it is easier for our Indigenous communities to understand that a clean energy project does not disrupt the land the same way as a mining project. You have a guarantee of a certain rate of return for 25 years. You have a sales agreement of the purchase of the electricity for that period of time. It's much easier to finance. There's smaller amounts. It's compatible culturally and environmentally, and there's a community customer at the other side. Mining has the other challenge that we do not know what the price of the mineral will be tomorrow or next week or the year after. So the revenues are very hard to predict. So for those reasons, that's why clean energy projects are of much more interest. I should point out that in Canada, of all the clean energy projects built in the past 15 years, there is a 20% ownership by Indigenous people in those projects. So it is wildly popular. It is a success, and it's generating revenues for Indigenous communities.
That's impressive. 20% of projects have Indigenous ownerships today.
No, 20% of all the new projects being built have Indigenous
Okay.
of across the country. It's different in each community. Some communities have 100% ownership, others have a much smaller percent. But if you look at all the new capacity in the past 15 years, combined, it's 20% owned by Indigenous people across the country nationally.
Got it. And, we've been researching Canada for quite a while, and the first equity agreements, we tracked them back to the 1990s, and it started to grow, and it started growing exponentially after 2015 or so. Um, in the early projects, the equity percentage of the community would be around 10 to 20% or so. But nowadays, there seems to be an unwritten rule of a 50-50 partnership in many projects. Where does that come from? And if you can share some examples of that.
The 50-50 comes from the concept that if you want to be equal partners with Indigenous people, 50% is where it's landed. That's where the number has come from. But you were right. Originally, there were much smaller percentages. The 50% came, though, in Ontario, which is a province in British Columbia. It's the most, in Canada, excuse me, in Canada. It's the most populated province. And it was a company called Hydro One. It is an electric transmission company. Canada, in many places, is trying to move towards the net zero electrification targets that were set. And politics now doesn't seem to speak about that anymore because now we're worried about Greenland and Canada in terms of the United States. But what it was the concept that if the province of Ontario wanted to meet the targets, they did not have time to negotiate with community by community by community on 12, 13, 14 transmission lines, traveling thousands of kilometers in all directions. So the company said, honest to the Indigenous people, you want to be partners? All right, 50-50. They set that level. The communities were surprised when that came because in most cases we would have to fight to be at 8%, 9%, 10%. And it was a speed decision by the electric transmission company. They had to get these done. And so that's what they came up with. That has become the standard now across Canada and increasingly internationally. The challenge for those communities is that then they have to find 50% of the capital for co-investing. But that's where the loan guarantees happen. That's where the bond markets come into play. And now increasingly, you're starting to see other creative financial mechanisms to make it happen. Because the projects that have this agreement, the first one was built 1 year ahead of schedule, $15 million under budget. The only way that this company realized that they would reach their targets, which is very aggressive by 2035, which is not very far away, was to have the Indigenous people as co-proponents so that they would also be vested or interested in achieving the short timelines for construction.
So this company partnered with Indigenous communities 50-50,
Yes,
and they managed to complete the project 1 year earlier and below the original budget. Is that correct?
yes, for the first project. They have now 11 more
The-
lines. They're going to do the same model. And Indigenous people across Canada and internationally have seen this. And so if you're an Indigenous person in your country and a company comes to you and says, oh, there's never been an example of a co-developed Indigenous transmission line, you can point to this and go, yes, there's not only one, there's 12 right there. And then these other ones are following as well.
Yeah. And plus the great example of the Wataynikaneyap project that Margaret was talking about in our last webinar as well. So Mark, let's focus a little bit on what the communities need internally to participate in these projects, because I guess it requires some changes in how you're organized. You need to strengthen certain capacities. You need to separate politics from business. What are your key recommendations for a community that wants to do this for the first time?
You were right. It's capacity. Can the nation come to the table? Can the community come to the table with the right people and the right trusted advisors to start moving in that direction? The challenge we have in Canada is that there are few Indigenous finance specialists. So we have to really work to find those or train our own, or we have to partner with groups that we trust and they understand the Indigenous values, the desires, and where the community wants to go. The next challenge has been finding the money, finding the capital for the investment. The loan guarantee program was not immediate. It took over 10 years of our work to convince governments to do that. Now that they're doing it, that's great. The question, though, is how much more money is going to be required if this model is expanded. So number one, capacity of the Indigenous communities. Second, access to affordable capital, affordable money for co-investing. The third one, as you pointed out, is governance. Most Indigenous communities in Canada are not organized in a commercial structure. We are organized as regional governments or sometimes as nonprofit societies, but to move to an agreement with a bank or a financial institution, the bond markets, and with companies, we needed to start setting up structures that those groups would recognize and would have the capability to enter business agreements. So those 3 points.
Thank you. And Um, can you tell us the story about the need to for communities to learn how to speak with white people?
Oh, we found very quickly when we started is that companies would come into our communities, usually white people, and they would be engineers or finance specialists or executives of companies, and they would not be speaking in the same terms as our indigenous people. And so what happened is that there was a meeting I attended, and what happened was, and I don't know if your indigenous communities are the same, but we don't follow time very well. If there's a 1 hour meeting, plan on being there for 8 or 9 hours because people have to talk. The elders have to say everything about where they're from, where their communities came from, who their grandparents were, how they were educated. It's just the natural way we do things in our indigenous communities. And white people would just run out of time, or they wouldn't listen, or they didn't think it was important. So after one of these meetings, I had to stop my community members and said, okay, if we want to be effective here, we're going to have to learn how to speak white. You're going to have to just talk about how much money we have, where we live, what we want. And our elders, the older people, were shocked. They were like, "That's so rude." I said, "Yeah, but that's what white people do. They just care about how much money they're making, where they're going on holiday next. Maybe if they lock the door in their house, they don't care about where we grew up, who our families are, who our cultures are." So I have to repeat that quite often with our people going into discussions. It's just about money. It's about time. It's where they're going on holiday. That's it. Go.
Thanks. And um, so now let's focus a bit on companies. And so we have noticed that companies are slightly sort of curious about this model, but they are quite reluctant or hesitant to take it on. And so what's a competitive advantage for companies to actually partner with Indigenous communities in equity deals?
So, what we're finding here in Canada is that companies who understand that it's a competitive advantage to have an Indigenous co-owner, a co-proponent, an investor, is that it makes it easier for them to get the project built. Very few companies will put 100% of their own money into a project. Usually, what they'll do is they'll put some money in, maybe 20%, but the other 80% they will go to investors, they will go to finance groups, they will go somewhere else to spread the risk. But if you have an indigenous party that is opposed to the project, very few other investors want to invest in that company. Some companies have realized that if they can get an indigenous partner first, upfront, that does two things. It speeds up the permitting of the project because the government realizes there's not going to be opposition from the indigenous party. If you were an indigenous co-investor in a project, why would you oppose your own investment? The second thing that happens is other investors realize, oh, if I can invest in a project over here, which has indigenous parties, will be built on time and maybe under budget and will produce revenue sooner than a project over here, which does not have an indigenous party, so it has more risk, they'll go that way. Governments pick that up. The third thing in competitive advantages is some companies have realized if they go into an area and they can secure the partnership of the Indigenous party as a co-investor, that Indigenous party will not invest with a competitor in that same region. And so what you're finding is some companies have realized that if they can do this, they basically block other companies from coming into the area for 20, 25, 30 years. So for those reasons, you're starting to see an increasing number of partnership discussions happening because it's become a commercial discussion, not just Indigenous rights, but commercial. And that has been what has been the greatest success of the coalition. You pointed out as how to speak white. There's also a side of this is how, as Indigenous people, we speak about the values that the investors want to see at the same time that protects what we're after. So it's that bridging between the indigenous values, commercial values, and how they make money at the same time as we achieve our self-determination goals.
And Mark, how many of these projects are now being proposed by Indigenous communities from the start, meaning this is not a company that is a main proponent, but it's actually a community that decides to do a project in the lands and then find the right partner for their project.
They are starting to happen more in Canada, and what you're starting to see is the projects are smaller if it's done by an Indigenous party. So I mentioned geothermal production in this, geothermal energy power, 100% by an Indigenous community in northern Canada. That's the sort of projects you're starting to see. You're starting to see companies in, smaller communities starting to propose things like battery storage facilities. These are large industrial battery facilities which will then feed power into the main electricity grid. So I don't have an exact number, but you're starting to see those starting to appear. In time, what we expect is as these projects are built and the revenues are starting to flow into Indigenous communities, that the Indigenous communities will then be able to access their own monies to initiate investment in projects. So it's happening. It's happening in different parts of the country. And it's not just in energy and clean energy production. You're starting to see Indigenous companies now wanting to move into critical mining space. That's more difficult, but it's starting to happen. The one thing I do want to point out is that at the beginning I mentioned that we have trouble accessing capital as Indigenous people. But because of different legal settlements and those cash deals that are already struck, there are pockets of pools of capital now around Canada. We estimate about $80 billion is controlled by Indigenous people in different places, but it's not in one account. So in time, you're going to start to see that being mobilized to start to invest not only in projects in their own communities, but to other communities where there is going to be an economic return and the communities are in favor. So there's developments happening. It's uneven, it's in different parts of the country, but it is happening.
Got it. And it seems to me that maybe the first project that a community does, maybe it's not the most profitable one because they've had to borrow a lot of money to be able to participate. But then as they start stacking one project on top of the other, that's where the magic happens. Is that correct?
Yes, and you'll start to see the sophistication of the Indigenous negotiation get better. there 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 is there are projects right now where the deals are good, but you're right, the returns can take some time. Think about this. If you're doing 50% equity ownership in a electric transmission line and you must access the capital from another area, the difference between the cost of the capital and the profit of the project will take quite some time to build over time. But what happens is exactly that. It does build. And eventually, in time, the sophistication of those negotiators from the Indigenous Party get better and better and better.
Great. So I'm going to ask you two more questions, and then I will hand it to Maria Paula to lead the Q&A session with the audience. So you recently visited Argentina last year. We were there in Buenos Aires for a week. You had the patience to speak to nine different groups, make slightly different presentations to all of them. Um, and I wanted to ask you, based on your impressions from that visit and your previous visit to Colombia and Cartagena 10 years ago, uh, does this remind you of where Canada was in, maybe 20 or 30 years ago?
It did. What was fascinating is meeting Indigenous people in those two countries is that we share the same desires, outcomes, hopes in terms of participating in projects that provide the cash flow that allow us as Indigenous peoples to make decisions for our futures. 20 years ago in Canada, the federal government made all our decisions for us. They told us where we would go to school, what education we would do. We were often told, no, there's never been an example of Indigenous people co-owning any business project, so stop asking. And that was very similar, the same hopes and dreams. What I want to point out is that the big change in Canada did not come directly from government. It came from investors because investors started to realize, hey, we want to see our money put somewhere that isn't harming people, that isn't harming the environment. And they started to pressure on companies and governments to do things differently. So the leverage that comes from an investor is much greater than we would ever have sole indigenous people in a region. So what was interesting about what I saw in South America is that investors are starting to ask the questions that we asked 20 years ago about how is this project being built? Is it fair? Is it just to the host communities who have the land? Is there a way to ensure that our investment benefits not only our investors, but the local people? So that was very similar. And you're starting to see that happening worldwide, not just in Canada, worldwide. So, yes, 20 years ago, we were not in this place. And I think what's interesting about this conversation that we're having, even, this is Indigenous people in one part of the world speaking to Indigenous people in another part of the world, willing to share the information, the examples, and in many cases, even the investors, the names of the investors, because we as Indigenous people in Canada will never be in competition with Indigenous people in South America, but we share the same objectives. So as a coalition of Indigenous people, we share all our experience with other Indigenous people.
Yeah, I have been a witness of that. Each time I approached anybody at your conference and asked for advice, or even whether they would be willing to share their experience with Latin America, everybody has said yes. I can certainly see that. So let's open it up to questions from the audience. I have a few more questions for you, but let's see. It's better to go to the audience. So Maria Paula, I'm handing it over to you.
Muchas gracias y bueno, Mark, gracias por tu apertura y toda tu generosidad en transmitirnos tu conocimiento y experiencia. Acá hay una pregunta en Q&A muy interesante, que es la diferencia de Canadá versus Colombia, no si sus propietarios de su territorio por ejemplo, la pregunta es si en Canadá tienen una experiencia, alguna experiencia donde el aporte de las comunidades sea la tierra, teniendo en cuenta que Colombia hay titularidad, o si necesariamente el aporte de las comunidades siempre tiene que ser, digamos, una inversión efectiva en dinero.
No, no. So in cash, no. Very few of us have the cash. Yes, there's $80 billion in this country from indigenous communities, but it's all over. It's not in one place. And often it's not in the right community. It's over there. So we need it over here. So no, it doesn't have to be in cash. It can be, and I want to point this out, our elders do not like us describing ourselves as a financial risk factor, but that's what we are. Every investor is looking to reduce risk. And if you can reduce risk, there's profit, there's money out of that. So the risk of us not protesting your project is worth something. It's worth a financial side. That's one way to go. The involvement of us speeding up a project by saying, if you agree with us and we're participating in this project, you'll be built 5 years faster. The revenue stream to you as an investor then comes 5 years earlier. That's worth something. There's a creativity of our people to say, okay, how do we translate the risk into an opportunity, and then how do we share in that opportunity? So it's still of benefit to the company and the investor, but then it's also on our side. It's not easy because they may not agree with that, but we've been successful at it. How to speak white is how Juan made the question. That's what we're doing. Sometimes we have to learn as Indigenous people how to speak capital markets, how to speak financial terms, how to speak time delay. It's up to us as Indigenous people then to make that bridge to that world, because engineers are not very good at coming our way. You speak to a finance person out of New York, and do they understand your Colombian values? Maybe, maybe not. So it's up to us to do that.
Gracias, Mark. Nos llega una pregunta que nos están haciendo directamente desde la comunidad de Trupio Gacho, en La Guajira, y es para las comunidades que apenas están iniciando este proceso, como es el caso de las comunidades que ves hoy conectadas y algunas otras. Ellas quieren tener claro cuánto tiempo pasa la comunidad entre avanzar en este proceso y empezar a obtener un retorno, una utilidad, digamos, concreta en los proyectos. Y cómo se da ese proceso, ¿no? Cómo sucede ese paso a paso.
Again, it's different for every project because every project has a different cash flow. So, for example, mining, as I pointed out, mines can take 8 to 10 years to build. So, if you are a community with an ownership in that, revenues do not start coming from the mine for 8 to 10 years. And then, depending on the investment or the borrowing or however you've accessed your capital, it may take another 5 years for you to see any revenue. So, it can be a long time out. Energy projects, clean energy projects, much faster because they can be built quite quickly. So it depends on the project. It also depends on the cost of capital that the community has accessed versus the return on the project. So if the cost of capital is 5% and then the return is just say 10%, there's a 5% spread there. So that will then start to flow to the community. We have seen many bad deals where communities have not been well educated on how cash flows operate, where they might get into a situation where their cost of capital is 8%, the return on the project is 9%, it's 1% spread. It's not very much, and that'll take much longer. So it just depends on how that's negotiated. Cost of capital is important. Length of time until revenues start to flow is important. Some examples we've seen is where the companies understand that the indigenous people politically, because we are elected as indigenous leaders in our communities, we have to show benefits sooner. So sometimes there have been agreements where the companies are structured in a deal where they will flow the contribution to the community quicker, understanding that they still has to be financed, but they will do that so the community understands that we don't have to wait 10 years for financial benefit. We might only have to wait 18 months or sometimes less. Again, it's the sophistication of the negotiation. And it's important that we as Indigenous people do what we're doing right now, speaking, because it's much more powerful to go to a company and say, you know what, here's a model and it works. We know it works because it's used here, here, and here. So, what do you think? Right? Be creative.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos otra pregunta y es, en la experiencia que ustedes han tenido y en los años que ya llevan implementando un poco este modelo, ¿cuáles han sido como las mejores decisiones para el manejo o digamos, la propiedad de las utilidades cuando ya se nota el retorno de los proyectos y teniendo en cuenta pues, que son muchos las comunidades que participan? ¿Cuál ha sido la mejor manera para organizarse alrededor del uso de esos recursos?
I'm going to use the example of my community only because I'm most familiar with it, but we copied that from other Canadian Indigenous communities. One of the dangers to some communities is that when money starts to flow from these projects, is sometimes it is spent immediately. It's given to the communities in a per capita basis, which basically means everybody gets an equal amount. The problem with that is that that only lasts as long as the project, and then what happens? The other thing that we found from our people is that if you do that, you don't just start to build up the money pools or pockets or group blocks of money that you can invest in other projects. So the best examples are permanent funds. They're like indigenous sovereign wealth funds. So what happens is the money in my example is from a mine. We get a percentage of the profit of the mine plus 25% of the mineral tax collected by the government. It comes into the community, and what we decided was we're going to save half of this for the future and invest it. Half will then be spent on projects of benefit to the community. But there is no, we do not do individual payments to people. It has to be for the community. And so because of that, after we've had this now for 12 years, we have $106 million in a permanent fund, which we invest in opportunities that provide more money back to the community. That's the best example. It's this investing for the future generations. And I can say this also as an Indigenous person. If you call a financial institution and they know that you have $100 million already in the bank or in investments, or some cases in Canada in the billions of dollars, they will take your call. They will work for you. They will come to you with questions. Investors will come. Other projects start to appear. Money talks. And I know that's not Indigenous, but guess what? We live in a world that is run by money. And then the money comes, we will then use that to do our values, language retention, taking care of elders, environmental protections, better education for our children, at the same time ensuring that we are respected by the other side.
Gracias, Mark. Voy a trasladarte una pregunta que nos hicieron desde la comunidad Lomomato, pero también alguna en el Q&A tiene que ver con esto y me parece que es muy interesante y es, una vez la comunidad ha entrado como co-desarrolladora y socia del proyecto, ¿cuál es la participación de las comunidades dentro del desarrollo del proyecto ya en sus fases construcción y operación y en el modelo de gobernanza y de toma de decisiones del rumbo del proyecto?
Again, that depends on the deal that was negotiated. You are right. You can be a passive investor, which means you just own it but don't have any say. So construction is not involved. Procurement, which is the contracts for services to the project. That can be everything from construction to driving trucks of materials. It depends. It has to be negotiated up front. So in Canada, we have also structures called impact benefit agreements. They're basically participation agreements, and they may be set up separately from the equity investment. So that would be conditions for you to work with a developer. And that might be a certain percentage of the jobs in the project, identification of skills that you would like your people to gain, either in perhaps electricity fields or in construction fields or in finance fields. The other thing that's important in the negotiations is what happens at the end of the project. Does the developer just leave everything behind, or that can be negotiated as well? But those participation agreements are important. The equity negotiations in Canada are separate because they come back to the sense of like, no, this participation agreement is because with the community, but this investment deal is like any other investment deal. We will be an co-owner of the project like everyone else. So there's two agreements. They go side by side. So yeah, you're right. You must negotiate everything. And guess what? Everything is negotiable. It just is a matter of asking and having your data in line that makes it in their interest to do that. So that takes creativity.
Creatividad e innovación son palabras clave dentro de este proceso, según lo que estamos aprendiendo de tu experiencia. Quedan muchas preguntas a las personas que han hecho las preguntas a través del Q&A, darles la tranquilidad y la certeza de que vamos a responderlas a través del sistema de preguntas y respuestas del proyecto y que cada una de sus inquietudes va a ser resuelta. Algunas comunidades incluso nos están escribiendo que están interesados en conocer más, así que nos vamos a poner en contacto con ustedes de la FIB para poder ampliar la conversación. Yo quisiera, Mark, obviamente aprovechar que estás con nosotros, que las comunidades te están escuchando, no solamente las que están en La Guajira, sino hay otras comunidades o representantes de las comunidades conectadas al webinar, para que pudieras en un par de minutos darles unas recomendaciones, cómo abordar este proceso, cuáles son tus mejores lecciones aprendidas para que a quienes están arrancando y tratando de tener confianza en este nuevo modelo desde el lado social y comunitario puedan aprender obviamente de ti y de todo lo que has vivido en estos largos años de trabajo. Entonces, quisiera dejarte un par de minutos para que te puedas dirigir a ellas y darles un par de consejos.
So the best place, as I mentioned earlier, is that we as Indigenous people in Canada will share all our information, all the learnings that we have accumulated over the past 10 years, 9 years. 9 years? Yeah, 9 years. It's a long time. You can go to our website, and it's only in English right now. It will be in French soon. I don't know if we will go to Spanish because I don't have the budget to do the translation to Spanish. But if you go to the Canadian website, our website at the Coalition, you will find there all our materials. And use Google Translate if you have to. AI will translate all of it for you about the models that have been successful. And we are a service organization to the Indigenous communities in Canada. So questions that we have, I'm sure the communities there will have the same sort of questions. For example, how does an electric system make money? What is a good financial return for a project that is either in generation or transmission or distribution of energy? Who has done a clean energy project very similar to what might be proposed in your territories? So there's our website, which is fnmpc.ca. There's another organization in Canada called Indigenous Clean Energy. And if you Google it or search Indigenous Clean Energy Canada, it will bring up a list of all the Indigenous participation in different projects across Canada. And there are hundreds of them. Look there for examples. Do not be afraid to, if there's a contact in there, write them. Tell them you're an Indigenous party. It'll have to be in English or French, depending where the community is to start, but you can use Google Translate to do that. You will have somebody respond. They will do that. In terms of investors, the investors that are starting to show up in Canada are international. They are looking for a financial return. I mentioned at the beginning, Juan mentioned the conference we have. We were expecting 2,000 people this year. We are increasingly getting investors from New York and London and other places in the world coming because they want to replicate the success that we're starting to have in their other markets. So if they're investing in Canada in a project, approach them and say, look, you're an investor there and you're also an investor here in Colombia. Why can't we do this? Don't be afraid to use courage to ask for things, even if you think, well, this is crazy, because guess what? Somebody somewhere else has done something like that. And if it's Indigenous, even better, because they will generally share their information. When we started to work on geothermal electricity, because we had never done that as an Indigenous community, we hadn't done that. As a coalition of nations, we had never done that. So we went on the internet and searched to see who in the Indigenous world has done geothermal plants. And we found in New Zealand, Indigenous people there own up to 50% of geothermal power. The Indigenous people in New Zealand provide 7% of the electricity to the entire nation. So we contacted them, just as I said here. We found an email address, we sent them a message, told them what we were doing. We promised to respect any information they shared with us, and they contacted us back. And now they come to our conference and they shared all their information about how to build a plant, how to negotiate proper employment agreements, how to negotiate closure agreements. So when it's removed, that the party has to remove the facilities. They all of that they shared with us. So be creative. Don't be shy. Somebody somewhere in the Indigenous world is facing the same problem, the same challenge, and they'll share that information with you.
Muchas gracias. Vamos a consultar toda la información que nos proporcionaste. Ojalá algún día puedas venir personalmente a Colombia y poder compartir toda esta experiencia con las comunidades. Estás más que invitado y serías muy bienvenido. Se encantaría tenerte acá. Muchas gracias nuevamente, Mark, desde la FIB, Meliquina y ConnectP y UK Pact por hacer parte del día de hoy y compartirnos todas sus lecciones. Paso la palabra a Juan para que puedan despedirse y muchísimas gracias a todos los que hoy se conectaron y aprovecharon esta bonita conversación. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, María Paula. Quiero agradecerle muchísimo a Mark por su generosidad. Quienes no lo conocen no saben que es una de las personas más ocupadas del mundo. Así que es muy especial y un privilegio poder contar con él hoy. Mark, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. It's fantastic that two communities could connect and listen to you directly and ask questions. We certainly look forward to being at the conference again this year. This time it will not only be me, but I hope we can bring some more people from our teams and the region. So yeah, thank you once again, and look forward to seeing you soon.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos.